Today we have Dr. Arvind Singhal with us. He's the Samuel Shirley and Edna Holt Marston Endowed Professor of Communication and Director of the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Texas at El Paso. And also, I know Arvind. I know of Arvind because when I started my PhD, I told my advisor that I was really interested in like media and education and entertainment, and she gave me this book from her bookshelf. Education, Entertainment, written by Arvind. And I also am aware that I never gave that book back, which is not good practice, but that is not the point of this anecdote. yes. And I've always really appreciated just learning a lot about the effective narratives and especially the characters in the story and how they get people to be inspired, learn from them, grow with them, and all these different changes. So I am very, very excited that you're here. We'll get to ask you a lot of questions and learn about a lot of different things. And we'll probably do this because I messed up something. The normal format, Arvind will be giving us a 20-ish minute presentation. And after that, we will probably have a more general conversation, or Arvind, however you want to continue this. Does that sound like a good idea? And we might be having Corey, one of your students, join us too.
That's correct.
Wonderful. Cool. I'm going to hand it up to you.
Okay. Well, when Ray called me and she said, welcome to the world of Nova, it's like, are you sure? I mean, these are people who are master storytellers. Talk about all the awards you've won. 48 seasons, 880 plus episodes. What the heck am I going to say that you're going to find meaningful? Well, she didn't show me that book, but she, sort of convinced me that perhaps there will be some value. I don't know if there's going to be any value. If there is any, you will know. And, that's the faith that I have. So I have to tell you that I first watched Nova within a week of arriving in the US. That was 38 years ago. I'd grown up in India. And I bought a $5 TV set, black and white, in a garage sale because I had arrived in the US to earn a master's degree in radio, television, and film production. And so this was, you need a TV set if you're going to study radio. So I watched Nova because I think the only channel I used to get was the local PBS channel. And this was in Bowling Green, Ohio, maybe ABC, NBC, and CBS, but that was it. And it was interesting. Nova was particularly interesting to me because even though I had arrived to earn a master's degree in radio, television, and film production, my bachelor's degree was in mechanical engineering. And, so I grew up with a love for science. My father's an engineer. My grandfather was a professor of mathematics. And from my early childhood, thanks to my grandparents living with me, there was a sort of a love for science. So I remember breakfast conversations with my grandpa, and he passed away when I was 10, when he would, suddenly pull out a pencil from his pocket and he'd say, do you know why pencils, if you do a cross section, are hexagonal? And which meant that, we knew what a hexagon was, and that would start a conversation, and then you'd learn that, okay, yes, when you hold a pencil and if it has 6 sides, it is easier to hold because there's more surface area, your skin coming in contact with it, they will not roll off a table, and also many other things. For instance, you can use the same amount of wood to make 11 hexagonal pencils as you would to make 10 circular pencils. And this has implications because they stack up. Well, no, and this has implications for how you pack pencils and, conservation and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. He would take a piece of bread, put whatever, cheese, tomatoes, lettuce, eggs on top, put another piece of bread on it. And then he'll say, how many different ways can I cut this sandwich? Like, you can cut it in this way, or you can cut it, this way. And he'd say, well, most people cut it along the diagonal. And why do people cut sandwiches along the diagonal? And, that would spark a conversation. So I had a very privileged, you can say, childhood or a very privileged relationship with science in my very home. It was sort of like a Nova playing out, And of course, then through the sandwich and cutting it along the diagonals. He would talk about Pythagoras, and the Pythagorean theorem, and why when you cut it along the diagonal and show the diagonal, you get a sense that you're getting more cheese and more tomato and more lettuce, because the diagonal always is bigger than each of the sides. And that might spark a conversation about if you're in a field and you need to get from one point to the other. If you cut across the diagonal, because the diagonal is not just bigger than each of the sides, it is also smaller than the sum of the sides. And so, you would get there quicker if you cut across a diagonal and so on. Anyway, so that's the sensibility that I sort of grew up with. And stories, context, maybe that was the reason why, as I earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, I sort of became a storyteller. Yeah. And I owe it in some ways to my grandpa. So I was a regular on All India Radio, which was the national radio network, doing programs for youth in Hindi and in English. And basically, I was a storyteller. I was trying to tell stories, not just about science, but, about life in general. And that's the reason, at 20 years of age, I came to the youth in radio, television, and film production. Now, Ray, I don't know, but I'm taking a very personal narrative stance to talk to you, and I hope you'll indulge me in proceeding with this further. Yeah, Ralph, you okay with that? I get a thumbs up. Evan, Robin, I can't see most of you, but Linda, you okay with that? All right. Okay. So why stories? And, as I said, you're master storytellers. Stories can take us to places where we've not. I mean, that's the power. In fact, I work a lot in the area of social change, use of narratives for changing beliefs and norms and behaviors. And I subscribe to the notion that if you want to understand a culture, listen to the stories that people are telling. And if you want to change a culture or spark change, then let the stories change, because stories can create possibilities that don't exist in the minds of people. It happens through transportation, and nobody knows this better than people at NOVA, right? I mean, you take people physically under the water and, being on the branch of a tree, if you're a chameleon or, whatever else, you take us to worlds where we've not been. Literally, physically, metaphorically, symbolically, transporting us to places where we've not been. So I want to tell you 3 of my favorite stories. And these are stories that I often tell. I'm sort of notorious for arriving in a classroom with no notes. I only bring my prayer bells, Tingsha bells, and I go with the energy of the room. So I'm going to tell you 3 very simple stories. And maybe in telling these stories, you will yourself see if there's any value in this dialogue or conversation you have. First story, with your permission, Abe Lincoln, somebody whom we all perhaps can connect with. If you're interested in geometry, that's a beautiful story. And that's because Abe Lincoln, as you know, he was an autodidact, never went to school and learned geometry. He read 6 volumes of Euclid on his own. And in the battlefield of Gettysburg, a devastating war between the Union Army and the South, a soldier walked up to Lincoln, saluted him, and extended his hand and said, "I'm, petty officer so-and-so. Oh, Mr. President, you're tall." Suddenly realized it was the first time he was seeing Lincoln that he was a tall man. And he said, "How tall are you?" Now, anybody here who knows how tall Lincoln was? They say when you're trying to tell a story, engage people. So you tell me, how tall was Lincoln? Pamela, I think you're lunging for your mute button.
Getting comments, 6'4", 6'6", over 6 feet.
Okay, 6'4", good. Oh yeah, I should be following chat. Yes, indeed. Okay. Yes. 6'4" and a half. Yeah, the tallest president that we've ever had. But of course, we see Lincoln with his stovepipe hat. And, that's 7 inches. So that puts him as a 7-footer. And, you would expect Lincoln would say, I'm 6'4" and a half. Well, so again, the question is, "Oh, Mr. President, you're tall. How tall are you?" And without blinking an eyelid, Lincoln says, "Son, like you, I'm tall enough that my feet reach the ground." Yeah, I'm going to just say it one more time. Son, like you, I'm tall enough that my feet reach the ground. Now, you can make whatever you may wish to make of this story, but too often, so many of us, when you become an expert, as if you're in science, you've got to be an expert. We are fairly technical, right? Nothing wrong with it. Accuracy and technicalities are important. We know that. Here's a commander-in-chief. Here's the president, apparently tall, a petty soldier talking to a president, a commander-in-chief, knows he's tall and asks, how tall are you? And the response is son, that connection, like you, relating to the person. Tall enough, a sense of humility, that my feet reach the ground, talking about the common ground on which we all stand. And if you read Euclid, you'll realize why that's the case. And many people say, if you go deep into Lincoln's thinking, that the Emancipation Proclamation comes out of this whole notion of the common ground, right? Oh my God, the common ground. If you choose not to be born, as Lincoln would say, and you're born, then you are on the common ground, no matter what color of skin or, where you are in the hierarchy. That's my first story. And I want you to just reflect on that a bit. You ready for my second story? Hey, Ralph, ready for the second one? All right, I get a little thumbs up. Robin, I got a big smile from you. You're probably saying, go ahead. My second story is from Mother Teresa. Now, I'll make a personal connection. I started a correspondence relationship with Mother Teresa when I was 17, which lasted for over a decade. And, my letter, I wrote a letter, it would get to, I was in Delhi, it would get to Calcutta, and, the response would come in a few days. She probably responded to it. So I became a collector of Mother Teresa's stories. In fact, I sometimes even teach a class, a 3-hour workshop on what we can learn from Mother Teresa and her life. So in this particular story, she's in Washington, D.C. The year is 1974. Well, we've just withdrawn from Afghanistan. You can imagine what was happening then. Vietnam War, a lot of, Dick Nixon is in office, and Mother Teresa arrives at Dulles Airport, and she's greeted by 1,000 people, looked like 1,000 people to her, with placards. And she was on a private visit, but a representative walks up to her and says, "Mother, we're so happy you're here. Tomorrow we are having a march in Washington, and we would like for you to march with us." And Mother says, "Well, my child, what's the march about?" And says, "The march is against the Vietnam War." And now there's silence. And the representative and his colleagues are like, "So Mother, you're going to march with us, right?" And she says, grasps the hand of the people who were in front and said, "My child, if you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry, my child. I will not be able to march with you. However, my child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead." My child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead. Now, this story speaks to me, it may speak to you in whichever way, in terms of the choices we make, of how we frame our world. Much like Lincoln, who naturally made a choice about framing the world of heights and measurement in a way that is somewhat more revealing and insightful, Mother Teresa takes an issue which is close to everybody's heart and says, "Against the war? I'm so sorry, my child. No, you may go ahead. If you were to choose to march for peace, I'll be the first to lead." Okay, third story, ready? And then we'll see what implications these stories have. I need a thumbs up from somebody. All right, Pamela. Okay, Ray, Ralph. Okay, good. Oh, Alyssa. Oh, of course, Christina. Nice. Okay. Third story is from Gandhi. And then you say, oh yeah, he's telling stories about Lincoln and Mother Teresa and Gandhi. And, and there's a reason why characters are important. No, it doesn't have to be a Lincoln or Gandhi or a Mother Teresa. But characters are important because they allow us in some ways to anchor and peg a story, a human character. Mr. Gandhi, father of the Indian nation. My grandfather my maternal grandfather worked very closely with Bapu for decades. And, father of the Indian nation wasn't dressed like the father of the Indian nation, no? No suit, no tie, even though, of course, he studied law in England and knew the value of, a stiff collar and a top hat. But later, the last 40 years of his life, he was basically dressed in nothing. No, I mean, he wore his spectacles and he wore a loin cloth wrapped around his, lower body, a cloth which he had woven himself. And some of you know this, many of you know this, but he always traveled third class by train and didn't take more space than any other common citizen when he was traveling by train. And people of my grandfather's generation would say, Bapu, we called him Bapu, father, loving father. Bapu, why do you travel third class? Why? We as a country can do better, right? And, you've got Air Force One, or Marine One, right? First Lady, Jill Biden, first. And you, father of the Indian nation, traveling third class. And his response always was, I travel third class because there is no fourth class. I travel third class because there is no fourth class. And that sort of symbolized, in some ways, who he was. I remember once being invited by a professor of chemistry who sort of challenged me in a very good way. He was doing a colloquium on storytelling and science and teaching. And he said, well, you work in social sciences, so I can understand the value of stories. How are you going to, for chemists? And I said, well, you can make some choices. And he said, would you come and give a lecture to my Chemistry 101 class? And, show us the value of storytelling. I said, sure, And so we began with Gandhi's salt. And, begin with Gandhi's salt. Why salt? Because Gandhi took on, much like WGBH Boston, Boston Tea Party, the British taxed tea, and, the tea was dumped in Boston Harbor. It was tea from India, if you go deep. Why? Because, the colonial, the British taxed salt in India, as they did many other things. And Gandhi takes on the British by writing to Lord Irwin and says, Mr. Viceroy, I believe, and he was a lawyer, that British policy of taxing salt is inherently and morally unjust. And, they taxed a lot of things, but he took them on salt. Why? Because salt is one commodity that the poor need more than the rich. Oh, because, think about 350 million Indian farmers working in the fields and perspiring and, their bodies letting go of salt. So poor people need more salt than rich people. And his argument was that by taxing salt, which the body needs, the body needs the sodium and the chloride ions, which are in perfect ratio in NaCl, sodium chloride. And, we know salt helps the body retain water. By taxing salt, you're placing a differential burden on the poorest of the poor. So I write to you, my brother, to say, this is morally unjust. So what am I saying? I'm saying I had this wonderful 1-hour session with the chemistry students, beginning with Gandhi's salt, going to, does the name Jim Grant ring a bell for some of you? Anybody here, Jim Grant? Bill Gates says that, Linda, all right, Jim Grant, you want to tell us a little bit about Jim Grant, Linda?
I made a film with him on child survival a long, long time ago.
Oh my God.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. I never met Jim Grant, but I met a lot of people who work very closely with Jim Grant. And as you know, he's credited, depending on whom you believe, that there are at least 100 million kids who are alive today, who wouldn't have been if it had not been for Jim Grant.
He was the head of UNICEF who led the effort on oral rehydration and breastfeeding.
You get
I'm going away now.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, Jim Grant. And, Linda, so we spent a good deal of the class talking about sodium and chloride, why these chemicals are important for the body. The positive and the negative ions, the fact that it has a perfect cubical structure, right? And if you take 100 grams of sodium chloride salt, as we know it, about 60% is chloride by weight and 40% is sodium. So you can talk about molecular weights and, why is it so stable? Why is it colorless? Why is it odorless? You link it to a salinity of seawater. Yeah, and we've all been inside the sea, whether you're surfing or, right? You can talk about salinity and water shortage, right? And you can talk about why in Boston, for instance, you, for several months in a year, have salt trucks, de-icing. And, what does it do with ice? What does salt do? How does it react with, hydrogen and oxygen? And you get the idea. And of course, Jim Grant, why? Because ORT, oral rehydration therapy, as Linda has said, oral rehydration therapy, a simple solution, a pinch of salt, a fistful of sugar, in one Coca-Cola bottle, as was common, in those days, of water, mix it, and you can prevent a death from diarrhea, right? So the whole child survival revolution, it's called the most significant public health breakthrough of the 20th century. Why? Because salt and sugar and water are available in every home. A child loses so much water when they have diarrhea, and rapidly, that it's by the time you take them to a clinic, it's too late. So here is a simple remedy that everybody has at home. If they know, a pinch of salt, a fistful of sugar, and water, and boiling water, and ORT, that's what the child survival revolution was. Jim Grant was also famous, Linda. I don't know if you saw him do this, but when he would be with heads of state, let's say he's meeting Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and there's a state dinner. He was famous for keeping an iodine testing kit in his pocket. What would you do with an iodine testing kit? He would probably request one of Mrs. Gandhi's aides, hey, could you pass the salt, right? As you would do on a table. And, he'd take the salt shaker, and then he'd pull out his iodine testing kit and, put a little drop of iodine, testing kit. And then he'd say, okay, good. The salt here is iodized. And he'd say, do you know, Madam Prime Minister, you have 120 million kids in this country that are stunted. And thank God the iodized salt here on this table is allowing us to live a non-stunted life. But there are so many kids in India. So Madam Prime Minister, do you see the value of iodine? And then, of course, Indian government passes a law that all the salt that we produce needs to be iodized. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Well, I'm telling you all this because there's tremendous potentiality in the choices we make, right? Tremendous potentiality. And the value of characters, no matter whether it's a Grant or whether it's a Gandhi or who is your driver, what's the story about? Can we relate to it? What's the context? Salt by itself is nothing. Well, it's sodium and chloride, and you can talk about that, but the Gandhian notion of salt, that every home has salt, the poor people are affected most, the zooming out, if you may, or the zooming in, the framing, how the issue is framed. Is it for peace? Is it against the war? Right? These are the sensibilities which make a difference in terms of how we connect. Most storytelling is of value, I believe, if it violates I'm going to use that word, violates expectancy. Science, the nature of science often is, it should be logical. That's okay. Yeah. So when you go into a class to talk about sodium chloride and you begin with Gandhi's salt or Jim Grant's salt, it violates every expectancy, but violates it in a way so as to create an insight. Yeah. To zoom in, zoom out, a different frame. It's unexpected, right? And science, of course, is imbued with the notions of mystery, like I'm on a hunt, who done it? So it has all those elements, the hooks, if you may, of bringing characters and context and, the mystery and the hunt. The important thing also, and this is maybe one thing which I would say, is what does it do for us to uplift us, right? Can the story be framed in a way that it uplifts a certain part of us? No matter whether you're underwater or no matter whether you're on the branch of a tree. The reason why I find the three personal stories that I've shared, I've sort of thought about this a bit. The story of Lincoln uplifts me in a certain way. I don't know what it does for you. The story of Mother Teresa uplifts me in a certain way. It speaks to my sense of what a higher self would be. It elevates me. It's a story which comes in as a tide, and NOVA, writers know about tides and, the moon's gravitational pull and why a tide comes in regularly. But it's a tide that comes and lifts all boats. It's a tide that comes and lifts all boats. And so you're asking, what's the current, right? What's that pull? And these are, they're not technical questions. They are questions about the art, right? The art of storytelling. And that's what you do, and that you do so well. So I think I'm just going to end there, because you know this world better than anybody else. But, this is my little world. And perhaps the most, maybe I'll just end with this, that once I was sort of challenged by a professor of mathematics. And he said, I'd like you to come and teach my students about differential calculus using a story. I'm like, okay, well, I did know a little bit about differential calculus. And I said, okay. And this is right after Usain Bolt. Does that name ring a bell for some people? Yes, I'm seeing some nods, okay. Jim Grant, not so many, but Usain Bolt. So we see the value of characters. Usain Bolt, he's 6'5". Does anybody know 100 meters in how much time? Still holds the world record. Ralph, you lunging for it? Or Pamela or Robin? Like we know, Lincoln was 6'4.5". 9.6, Christina, very close, 9.58.
Oh, rounding?
Lovely. Okay, now the 0.58 is very important. No, the 0.02 is very important. We know when you're talking about a world record. Okay. Oh, I see Corey laughing. Corey is my wonderful graduate student colleague from the University of Texas at El Paso. She's a storyteller. She worked on Nigerian television, and we are very fortunate to have her in El Paso. And she's doing an independent study with me this semester on storytelling. So I asked Rehana, hey, do you think Corey can join us? I mean, I'm going to tell some stories and she'll see what sense she can make of it. Okay, differential calculus. I said, now Usain Bolt, 9.58, 100 meters. What was his average speed? Right? And you can say 100 meters covered in 9.58. And it's like, oh, yeah. So I said, this is the question, was Mr. Bolt running at that speed all the time? What about the 10-meter marker or the 20-meter marker or the 30-meter marker or the 40-meter marker? Oh no, well, he lunges. Initially, he's at a certain, then, he picks up speed and then he maintains it, right? So he is running at different speeds per different units of distance, And that is what differential calculus is. You're interested in the rate of change.